Okay, here's a question that is coming up quite a bit. Specifically, I'm going to answer Ashleen Murphy, her question, which is, how do you run a dashboard user interview? Now, you've got several questions about user interviews, so I'm just going to kind of bundle them all together. And first, let's start with the difference between what is a user interview and what is a stakeholder interview. In the approach that we follow, there are two distinctly different categories or personas of person. The end user is the consumer of the dashboard that we're building, the insights that we're developing, the visualizations that we're putting together. The stakeholder is not necessarily the end user. They might be, but we're looking for the stakeholder to give us more direction on goals, strategic vision, right? Where are we going and how are we going to measure success? So there's a key difference between the two. So let's get into this one first, which is the user interview. So how do you run a dashboard? And then more specifically, can you just give some examples, right, of how you would do this in the real world? So, like, as you know, my background is in, before I got into analytics, I was a director of user interface design and user experience. And a lot of what we're seeing here is borrowed from the field of user experience. Now, if you're running a proper interview, you need two people there to conduct the interview. Ideally, that's the ideal setup, right? So you have someone who's like taking notes and listening to what's being said, and you have the other person who's asking the questions, reading body language, right? And really trying to engage with the person that's being interviewed. So that's very, very important, right? So, but we usually don't get there, right? Even now, when I'm working with our own clients, I won't always get to have two people there. I would say it's more the exception than the rule. Usually it's just myself. Now, my preference is to run these things in workshops, right? But quite often it's just me and the person I'm interviewing, either in person or on a video call, right? And so just take that caveat, okay? Ideally, we want to have two people, but I know the reality is we often won't. We won't have two people. These questions are very, very carefully put together, right? So we've been thoughtful about how these questions are being framed, and particularly the words. Right? We're not really asking the why. It's more what we want to do is assume that they have already thought about this, giving them the benefit of the doubt. So with that in mind, we are interviewing the end user. So let's just jump down to the end user template. Questions are slightly different for what they would be for the stakeholder. So name. Okay, so let's go fill this in. Name, Jane Doe. And role, let's go with HR manager. We'll take a HR example just because it's fairly easy and straightforward to relate to. Now, let's look at this very first question here. What does your typical week look like? These questions were framed from the perspective of, let's say you have someone who's maybe not a good people person, maybe a little bit more introverted, and you're asking them to run an interview. Maybe you're stuck and you're short-staffed, and you just have to have someone on your team maybe who's not really great people person. And so some of these questions are framed in a way that, okay, well, what if it is someone who just can't naturally have a good, engaging conversation and break the ice? So this first question is more along those lines. It's an icebreaker. It's like, well, what does your week look like? It's to get the interviewee talking, right? So having a little bit of back and forth, having a bit of a conversation. That one's fine. But sometimes you might get some really interesting nuggets out of that, right? They might say, you know what? Start of my week, I just have to deal with a whole ton of requests that are coming in for a certain report, right? And my day's gone, we may find there's opportunities here to address challenges that they have. They might raise some challenges. So it's not just an icebreaker. Other things might come out of this. If we look at the second question, how do you currently access and use data? So we're not assuming they don't, right? We're giving them the benefit of the doubt that even if they don't use data currently, we're kind of just assuming that they do, right? But it's up to them to tell us if they're not. The intent here is to understand, are there existing systems, existing processes, tools, reports, and metrics that they like to see, right? So this is going to be important, particularly when it comes to managing change and adoption down the road. We have to understand what the current experience is, because when we introduce a potentially very different experience, we need to know that. Okay, so we have to try and keep the the change gaps as reasonably small as possible while still making progress, right? We don't want to introduce additional friction where we don't need to. Next question here. What are your current challenges in relation to reporting? So maybe there are some barriers there that we need to know that we are not aware of. And here's that opportunity for them to talk about it. They may also just generally talk about problems they have with data, which is great. We need to know those, because if we can help them address them, that's going to be a win and like a value proposition we can use later on, right? When we're trying to drive adoption is, hey, you know what, Jane often spends quite a lot of time just manually curating some of the data in Excel. With this new dashboard, we're able to save her about 2 hours a week, right? So that can be quite a compelling value or benefit that people would get from using this dashboard. Okay, on to the next question. What goals do you have in your role and how can data help? This one can be a little bit surprising because sometimes people have been in their role so long, they've been moved around an organization quite a bit. They might have a well-defined role, so you just have to be a bit open here, and it might take them a while to figure out what it is. Mightn't take them any time at all. And how can data help? We're asking them to engage in a conversation where they're the one presenting how data can help their role, right? They may have never been asked this before. And here's an opportunity for them to start to brainstorm and start to think, well, yeah, I mean, if I had this and this data, it's going to help me do things this way. So this one can take a while, but it's a high value question to ask. The next 3 questions are really very similar in intent. It's just kind of asking the same thing in 3 ways. And you might get different answers, right? So the very first one is, what metrics do you currently look at? That doesn't mean we're going to take all of those metrics that they list and put them in this new dashboard. But we need to be aware of them. And maybe there's tremendous value in those metrics that are there. Maybe someone's really thought through it and we should include it. But it doesn't automatically mean we have to. Just another thing to be aware of, though, is if we do start removing existing reports that people have and start replacing them with a new dashboard and it doesn't have the metrics they expect to see, even if they're not valuable, it could be a point of friction. So we want to capture that here as well. Next question is, what metrics would you like to see? So they have the existing metrics from the previous step. Now we're asking, is there anything additional they'd like to see? The last one is the one where we need to spend the most time. What are the top questions you want answered from the data, right? So this is very blue sky, not constrained with the data challenges, not constrained with historical reporting and dashboards. It's really, what would you like to be able to answer? Completely blue sky. What would you like to be able to answer? And what would it mean to you, right? And it kind of goes back to one of the previous questions there, right? Is how can data help their role? So very, very high level approach to how you would run this interview. I generally like to have 30 minutes to 45 minutes to run an end user interview for a dashboard. And you would then take all these interviews, of course, right? And you'd bundle them together when you've done them. And you'd start to figure out, are these the same persona, right? So we might have interviewed 5 HR managers, but you know what? Maybe we found 2 of them were kind of fairly distinctly different and didn't match up to the other 3. We might then investigate, well, should they have a separate tab on the dashboard? Should there be some different use cases, some different scenarios there for them in order to address that? So hopefully, folks, that deals with your question. And we can dive into that more if you want to get into further depth. But I would also deal with, on another video here with the question on the stakeholder interview, and then how do you take all of those interviews and start formulating them and putting them into a persona.